Well, wonderful to be here. As you all know, we're here with Club of Remy with Bernard Scott, who I affectionately think of as BCE Scott. And we'll be discussing his chapter 3, along with Thomas Manning. Bernard, I wondered if you wanted to make any opening comments.
No, I've already made the opening comments, which were to say thank you for people
Wonderful.
coming and taking the trouble to comment on my book. It's gratifying.
Oh, what a pleasure.
Thank you.
What a wonderful book. Thomas, would you like to give us a little bio on yourself? I don't think everyone knows you.
Okay, my name is Thomas Manning. I'm currently doing a PhD in Education, Practice and Society at the Institute of Education at University College London. I became interested in cybernetics through stumbling across Stafford Beer's work when I was an undergraduate and interested in complexity and systems science. And my specific interest in Gordon Pask's work came when I was doing my PhD and had a intuition that the way reasoning is talked about in certain branches of seemed very similar to kind of what was going on in conversation theory, particularly in reference to what I could understand of the Wikipedia page on conversation theory at the time, and also some of Gordon Pask's original papers on Paul's websites, which I'm very grateful he's put up on there, because if that wasn't there, I would not know, or at least have an easy way to get into conversation theory other than the main books. We do have them at UCL, but it was the purple book, and you really need the book before that, the green book, as I kind of call it, to understand the later book, which deals more on analogies and more complex stuff in the green book. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
These
and
are
Paul?
Pask's, I'm sorry?
Oh no, over to you, Paul.
Thank you. These are Pask's Conversation, Cognition, and Learning, which is the green book, and Conversation Theory, which is the purple book. I'm Paul Pangaro. Many of you know me, but just briefly, I met Pask because he was working in Negroponte's lab, the architecture machine group. And to me, the inspiration for that laboratory came from Gordon. And when he walked in, all of the AI and theater and humanities and all the other things I have been studied suddenly made sense. And so I did a sharp right-hand turn and spent about a decade roughly with Gordon. I think the first day I stopped by System Research was one of Bernard's latter days, if not his last day there. I was hardly a successor in any sense, but by coincidence, that moment occurred. And then Bernard and I met many years later, and have since, I think, forged a wonderful friendship and collegial relationship, which I cherish. And we speak periodically, and that's very important to me. And as others have heard from me, I think his book is very important. Also, full disclosure, I was asked by the publisher before it was published to give comments. I'm not sure which ones he followed. I know that he followed one or two, but of course that's entirely at his discretion, and I'm just teasing, of course. So today we have a little bit of a plan, as alluded to. We have questions planned in a cadence, just to give it a little bit of structure, but they're not fixed. We may divert, we may come back and forth, of course. And we'll do this and then open it up to discussion. I think it's very nice if we could take a break in about an hour. I think if the pixels are tiring, I would get a refresh of coffee probably. And we'll see exactly where we do that, just a couple of minutes in the middle. Thank you, Jason, for nodding. Please tell me if I'm contradicting anything that you normally would do. And I might, with the indulgence of everyone, interrupt if it feels like we've gone down a rabbit hole of vocabulary and things that aren't quite available to everyone, just to make sure we're keeping it on a level that indeed anyone, not just those in this room who are largely familiar with these ideas, but that the video itself would have value afterwards to others who would want to come back to it. So this is the plan. Jerry Letfin used to like to call his role the immoderator. And I don't wish to take that on fully, but it's sort of along those lines. So here we go. I'll kick it off with your permission. So as you know, today we're here to talk about part 3 of this beautiful book, which is called The Story of Cybernetics, which is a really wonderful naming. Previously, of course, part 1 was about the publication and the first look. Part 2 was A Life in Cybernetics, which was about Bernard's life, of course. And now part 3, The Story of Cybernetics.
Bill is here
Okay,
with the plumbing.
great. Okay, wonderful. I apologize. Our heating system is broken and is now being repaired. So I apologize for that little break. So here we are with the story of cybernetics. Bernard, you begin this part by saying, and I quote, "I am not aware of any single text that gives a clear and comprehensive account of the origins, early years, and later key events concerning cybernetics." I happen to agree with this, but my question is, why is that so? Why, after 80 years, there was no such book?
Okay, thank you, Paul. I thought about it, but I thought of this at the time. What we have books by Andrew Pickering and Stephen Himes, which deal with cybernetics in various ways, but they're written by, in my view, they're written by outsiders. They're written by historians who map the events in different ways, but they map the events, but they don't necessarily get to grips with the cybernetics as I see it, as a meta discipline, and what I view as the key concepts. And basically, I could call it the architecture of cybernetics. I use that word because there was an interesting obituary someone wrote, maybe you, Paul, for Heinz von Förster, in which it said that Heinz was, the great architect of cybernetics, and that he set out its overall conceptual structure, first order, second order, and so on. So the baffling thing for me was that for many years, certainly within the ASD, there was discussions about the need for introductory text to cybernetics, and a lot of stuff was posted on the website, but I think the problem was herding cats. So the teamwork approach to get an introductory book written didn't work out. So it ended up being left to me. Thankfully, I've been thinking about this for many years, off making notes, giving presentations about cybernetics, then, now, and to come, that kind of overview. So I had a rough idea what I wanted to do, but it was chiming up Marcello when he took on this role of editor of the Brill series in social cybernetics and complexity. It is pushing, in a way, that got me down to work.
Bernard, what do you think about Walter Cannon's work? I think it was the 1930s, Wisdom of Body. I think that points to the concept of homeostasis, and also influenced Ashby, I guess.
Okay. Yeah. Well, these are topics in the story of what became cybernetics. First, I should say that some years ago now, Jason wrote a book, a draft of a book about cybernetics, which he kindly sent to me. I read the manuscript a couple of years ago or so, and I still wish he would turn it into a book. There's an enormous amount. It's a good introduction from a different perspective. But with respect to Cannon, so it kind of so there's another question coming up. The next, I think, this is a question from Thomas. Thomas.
Yeah, I have.
Shall I read you? Do you want to read your question?
I can read it sort of like myself, but this is something I found quite interesting for myself. But you said you argue that the story of cybernetics has several possible beginnings. In your text, you specifically focus on behavior, purpose, and teleology by Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow. as one of the possible, perhaps central beginnings. But from you personally, are there any other possible beginnings or possible strains which led to the emergence of cybernetics?
Okay. There are later questions which are relevant, but the key here is it seems to be 1943, as I see it. In that same year, we have McCullough and Pitts, and the idea is imminent in nervous activity, where they introduce logical nets, and of course they made their connections with Wiener and others. And we also have in 1943 a lovely little book called The Nature of Explanation by a British psychologist called Kenneth Craik, who in the wartime years studied the human operator, and he used what we'd now call cybernetic concept to refer to how human operators behave. But we would say as observers, if you like, but human operators running military task with running military machinery, shooting guns and things. So it's sort of ergonomics as well, you could call it. But he wrote this little book called The Nature of Explanation, in which he argues that the main function of the brain is to model and anticipate, create a reality. It models reality for us and anticipates what's to come. So it's thoroughly cybernetic in its vision of how the brain works, how the mind works, whatever you want to call it. And sadly, he died in 1948 of a motorcycle accident. And in later years, Warren McCullough discovered him, became aware of his work, and Warren celebrated him as a proto-cybernetician and published a book called The Nature of Psychology, which is a collection of writings by Kenneth Craik, which I recommend. I recommend The Nature of Explanation. It still is fresh. It's just seems smaller than my book. It's a beautiful little book. Now, the problem with telling the story of cybernetics is that you've got roots going back at least as far as Aristotle, which are highly relevant, as acknowledged by people like Gregory Bateson and Warren McCullough in their discussions. And we also have many things in between, which are covered in various places. I particularly like the introduction to the proceedings of the Macy conferences, which are edited principally by Heinz von Furser, but also Margaret Mead and someone else whose name I've forgotten. And there's a long essay by the editors about the origins of cybernetics, and they mention a number of related work which has cybernetic flavour, including Ampère and his last Cybernetique, which is about government, and also Julien de la Mettrie, who in the 18th century caused a huge controversy by writing a book called Man, a Machine. And he presented a materialistic, sort of kind of mechanistic view of man as a machine. And he was a renowned atheist. So he was controversial. I just reminded myself about him because someone I read about and learned about many, many years ago, but there's a nice Wikipedia article. I've just sent a link through to ASC Conversations referring to him.
Bernard,
Yes.
Bernard, forgive me for interrupting. I think what we're wrapping together here is two different things. One is any volume or point of view that would come out, let's say, before 1940 would have one point of view. From 43 perhaps to the 50s and 60s would have another point of view. And then thereafter would have a third point of view. So would you say that, so back to one of the questions, why do you think it took so long to create a book that had that comprehensiveness, that had it through that full scope? So
okay. So I was sort of dwelling on the topic of origins, which I find very interesting. And as you know, lots of people have been doing some historical excavations about parallel work that they've discovered, like what it's called, tectonics or tectronics or something, some German. So it's a bit of a mystery to me, Paul. As I say, the place where it was discussed, the idea of having an interesting, and well, let me stop. Let me not forget, we've got Principia Cybernetica, which is the major effort by.
Do you think of that as a collection of pre-existing works, or also as commentary on those works?
There's a lot of bias, a lot of commentary in there, but it's a useful resource. We also have the encyclopedias, the 2-volume encyclopedias, which were produced by, name escapes me.
What are these encyclopedias, sorry?
Pardon?
I've heard of them. These encyclopedias, are there specific encyclopedias on cybernetics?
Yeah, there's two. It's a 2-volume one. There's a story to it. I refer to him in the book, but at the best of times, my memory is shaky, and today I've got seasonal sinusitis, which is kind of a nagging pain. I can't think very straight. I'm doing my best, but it's very famous. Someone in the audience may not be familiar with these encyclopedias, this 2-volume encyclopedia, and the author. Is anyone familiar with it?
Not coming to mind. Let's put that aside for the moment. Maybe it'll come and we can.
Well, I'll try and find it. Knew about him, and many people did or do.
What are you looking at, Bernard?
But in the book, towards the end,
Your book itself.
Yes, somewhere the problem with one problem with the book is the font is so small. It's I don't want to. Please, I got published by these publishers, but I don't want to say too many critical things about their approach. Anyway, somewhere in there, there's a reference to further reading.
Great.
And those are wonderful tomes because they do give you, a whole variety of different perspectives and different uses of, I'll put it this way, different terminology for essentially the same concepts, and the same terminology being used in different ways for different concepts. So it helps you unravel the mess that is cybernetics as a discipline.
I think Paul had another question.
I do, but Bernard said something very interesting there. The mess that is cybernetics. What did you mean just then? In what sense is it a mess?
Well, I mean the mess of discourse, particularly currently, which seems to have, I don't know, it seems to have flowered. I think following the revival of, or the attention that was paid to second-order cybernetics in the 80s, given that Heinz made the distinction in 1974, it wasn't picked up for a while. And the kind of humanistic side of cybernetics became emphasized, particularly in the ASC. Must admit, I only attended one meeting of the ASC, and that was in the UK. It was beyond my means to get to the States at the time when the meetings, which are still going on, are going on. And I think it brought in a lot of different voices and a lot of refreshing new perspectives. But some of the sort of, you might call the hardcore concepts got sort of washed away, lost from view. I always thought that, everybody on the planet should become familiar with Ross Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics. And I give an account of going to a conference in, I think, 1996. 1995, I went to a conference, Einstein Meets McGreet, as a special thread about complex systems or whatever. And the people from different disciplines, they're biologists and computer scientists and sociologists, psychologists, whatever. And there's a lot of crosstalk, which wasn't getting further. But the one thread that kept people united and focused was that most people were familiar with Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics. and it still stands as I see it, as a kind of must-read foundational text for anyone who wishes to take cybernetics seriously.
Yeah. Bernard, one might say that that particular text, however, is technical in a sense, and therefore may not be as accessible, certainly, as your book.
This is true. I do make note of that, but I'm actually goes so far as it uses a simplified version of set theory, and
Yes.
These days, you know, certainly in the UK, set theory, basics of set theory are taught in primary school.
Excellent.
But it's not, again, it's another reason why I emphasize, you know, some is the science, is that, back to later questions coming up really, it's like the two cultures problem, highlighted by C.P. Snow in the 50s, I think. On the one hand, you've got the arts and the humanities, on the other hand, you've got the sciences, the formal disciplines, and they seem to be living in different worlds. Well, they communicate in different ways, they think in different ways, and I think it's great there's been influx of interest from the humanities and philosophy and the arts, design, wherever, into cybernetics, second-order cybernetics. But I would still argue that anyone engaged with cybernetics really ought to have a go at attempting to get to grips with the formal aspects. Again, my part 4 of my book is intended to be a relatively pain-free introduction to some of the formal concepts as I see them. But I don't, I mean, put it another way around. When I discovered cybernetics and went to work with Gordon Pask, I was already a graduate in psychology, you know, as a university graduate, but I knew nothing about I knew nothing about the formal sciences, set theory, formal logic, stuff like that, theory of computation. I had to study this off my own initiative.
Understood. Again, I think the beauty of your book is that it is so accessible and is so open to a wide range. It says social sciences, but I'm giving this book to anyone who's interested in, and it has great power. Let's move on a little bit and talk about the next section. So your part 3 has itself 4 sections. I'm sorry, not the next section, but the question really. So there's beginnings, later years, decline and renewal.
Yes.
Cybernetic explanations, and then Gordon Pask's conversation theory. So we'd like to look into some of these a bit. So in the first section of your part 3 of your marvelous book, you mentioned both the Macy conferences of the 40s and 50s, of course, and Wiener's book, Cybernetics.
Yes.
It's a 2-part question. Would you be willing to assess the relative contribution of each? Are these two things separable? A book written at a moment in time, based on the history that, of course, Wiener pulls forward from 43 and Rosenbluth and so on. Meetings, which he was to some extent engaged in, but which was the architecture of McCullough and had a different format, right? A book is very different than a series of meetings. So were there relative contributions that you'd be willing to say? And secondarily, if one or the other did not exist, if there were no Wiener book or no Macy meetings, how do you think cybernetics would be different today?
Well, just to begin with your first point, that without the Macy meetings, there would have been no, shall we call him Wiener or Wiener today?
I can't find a justification for Wiener other than the fact that in a prior generation,
What's your usage at the moment?
I say Wiener, and I haven't been able to find anyone
I'll
who
say,
just about.
I think I can never make up my mind. Like what I use. Something comes out. I actually prefer Wiener, but Wiener.
Many others, yes.
Wiener's book I don't think Wiener's book would have existed in the form it did without the Macy meetings. But I could step back a bit further and say that this may not be completely the case, because the reason why I quoted the beginnings as the 1943 Wiener, Rosenbluth and Bigelow is that you've got there, so key concepts in cybernetics of control, communication, anticipation, anticipatory systems, prediction, all that stuff. And it's being dealt with in the great thing they do, because you've got the mathematician, you've got the biologist, physiologist, and the engineer. But what they do, all three of them agree that their approach is touching on some universal issues, the questions about teleology, purposiveness in living systems, purposiveness as they go on to generalize, purposiveness in any system which has got which controlled by negative feedback happening within it. So they universalize their work that we're doing on anti-aircraft artillery systems. I think was the main place where they were working on prediction, automatic prediction systems, and they universalize it. And it's a great challenge to, or if you like, it resolves, to my mind, resolves great philosophical topics that have been discussed since Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle discusses teleology, teleological systems, not in those, but it just means purposive systems that have goals. And it was, anyway, so there's a long history preceding that birthplace for cybernetics, which I think is wonderful.
So
I
here
mean,
you say, go ahead, Thomas. No, please.
I know Hegel says, following Ecclesiastes, that there's nothing new under the sun, and in some sense, a lot of like problems we have now have been discussed like in history in one form or another. I agree with Bernard's point with Aristotle's like teleology, in that a lot of it is very similar to sort of like certain ways of thinking about things in contemporary cybernetics. It's just that a lot of the terminology is different. I think Warren McCullough mentioned this in his reading of Descartes when he was specifically, I think when Descartes was taking apart sort of animals and looking at them, he had certain like ways of framing like anatomy and sort of various neurological stuff, but it was quite similar to sort of how it was being discussed in the contemporary era where he was alive. It was just like a different terminology, but there are some similarities in that. So yeah, but Paul, if you go on.
Well, I'm happy to go on. Thank you, Thomas. I don't want to dwell too much on the philosophical roots, because that's where you get into the confusions that arise because of different labels for different concepts, or the same label for
that's fair enough,
different labels, so on and so forth. But I've just been out of my own, for my own entertainment, I've been doing some reading of Aristotle, and I've read a couple of introductory books, one of which gives the Greek with translations for some of Aristotle's key concepts, like teleology and cause and so on. The other introductory books is written more for like a 12-year-old, and it doesn't give you that kind of tighter view of the language used by Aristotle, the concept used. But my understanding is go this way. You have with Aristotle the concept of psyche, which gets routinely translated as soul, and aligns with the Jewish conception of soul as something eternal or spirit-like. It's a different substance. So that, and you also got Aristotle's account of essentially mechanistic account of how organisms function, and that the purpose of their organization. And Aristotle uses the word psyche to refer to different organizations. So plants have one kind of organization because they reproduce and grow and feed in their own way, and animals have a different kind of organization in that they also move about, and humans have all the other properties of living systems, except they, while being moving about, they reason. They've got mind-like qualities. So you can see this idea of different forms of organization within different living systems as a precursor to cybernetics understandings of organization, but the word psyche gets hijacked in various ways in later years. And by the time you get to Descartes, you've got his dualism, which is the mental, the mind as a separate substance, separate ontologically distinct kind of thing from the matter, the material. He's got this mechanistic view, and it gets very, very confusing from then. And because he's made this huge distinction, and some people map it back to, well, I won't go dwell too far, but the reason I like telemetry I mentioned earlier is that he takes the materialist mechanistic view of how organisms work, and he quite naturally assumes that it's the working of the organism which gives rise to the experiences of thinking and emotion and so on. He's not a Cartesian dualist at all. He's not quite perfect, because at the time, in order to characterize living systems as such, he was a vitalist. And as some of you may know, that this is the general argument about living systems that emerged.
Bernard,
Yes.
forgive me. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'd like to come back to the book, especially. I've had a comment from one of our other participants here who'd like us to focus on the book. I think I've let you.
I'm sorry.
I've led you astray in the way I'm questioning you. So I think we've established your comment
Well,
that
that's all for my next book, then, Paul.
wonderful. Although we can't wait. We can't wait.
I should also quote Sonny Boy Williamson II, the famous blues singer and harmonica player. Don't start me talking. I'll tell you everything I know.
Yes, well, that's where we are right now.
Sorry, at one point, I should leave now because I have to be in another place. But I suggest, if any of you have a proposal of a manuscript to do this book, I am very happy if you send me a new book, Bernard, or maybe Paul. You have to think in 40,000 words, and we will try to publish in Brill. So, and I am very sorry because I have to leave to other meeting. I hope the meeting will be fantastic, and it's a pleasure to listen all of you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
And remember the idea. I am waiting manuscripts for the collection. It's not easy to find authors. Okay. Okay. Bye bye.
So
see you.
Bye bye, Charmy.
So I think we've established that you feel that without Macy, the book Cybernetics by Wiener would have been different, or perhaps not exist. Certainly it would have been different, is I think what we've established so far. I'd like to go a little further. In your next section of part 3, you talk about the later years, decline and renewal, which is beautifully stated because it ends on renewal rather than on decline. So clearly the field has had some good times early on and not so good times ever since. Would you agree with that? And what could have been different? What could have been done differently? And of course, I know that you'll call upon its ideas, of the ideas of the field and what was and wasn't done. But I'm not asking for a recapitulation of what happened, so much of what could be done differently. And is there a chance for doing things differently now in the 21st century on behalf of the field?
I want to begin by answering that by just taking up from what we were talking about with respect to Wiener's book. I think I've said before, I think I say it in the book, I've certainly said it many times. I think the invention of the concept of cybernetics, the term cybernetics and the concept of it by Wiener is a huge cybernetic achievement. It's a contribution to human thought. In the history of ideas, it's an idea which is brilliant.
Agreed.
Because it's unifying, and it's also it's transdisciplinary, it's unifying, it's also bound to science. I mean, it's got a scientific, formal, rational basis for it. And it gives a completely new standpoint to look at the world from which to look at the world. Good. So all that is still strikes me. Without the label, I don't know what would have happened to the Macy conferences.
I see. So that's the reciprocity there. That's beautiful. Good.
Yeah. But with respect to decline, as you say, sort of gone through this, the events that led up to the decline, and why the renewal, as we already mentioned, the efforts of the ASC to spread the word, as it were. But younger generations come up and they show interest in these ideas, which have been largely sidelined thanks to AI and so on. So, but I've just sent another link to about I don't know, something to do with the social sciences, computational models in the social sciences, and there's no mention of cybernetics. So there's an enormous amount happening in the world, in the scientific academic world, which is essentially cybernetic in character, or really is crying out for cybernetic concepts to give them some order and some coherence, and to make them more aware of each other. I mean, I like the idea that cybernetics is, when it works well, is transdisciplinary, but it provides a lingua franca, as Ashby does, in which people can talk about these issues of complexity and modeling and simulation and dynamical systems and all that stuff, as well as very sophisticated concept of what it means to be a human.
Again, I think we here know this. The question is, what can be done better? I don't know that the ASC has been successful in bringing about a renewal of cybernetics. It's kind of hanging on to it. I say that as current president. But what do you see could have been done differently or done now to perhaps accelerate a renewal or ensure a renewal?
Well, I think I agree with, well, there's several directions I could go, but one is I agree with Ranulph when he was president of the ASC. He organized something called the Cybernetics Coalition. He was aware that the ASC, like many other societies to do with systems and cybernetics around the world, are quite small, with limited membership, limited resources, who are kind of brought together by the IFSR or the ISSS or WOSC, the World Organization for Systems and Cybernetics, as umbrella organizations which organize conferences, in some cases provided some kind of over-admin support, but they weren't really helping cyberneticians around the world unite and become a stronger force. So I thought there was a real vision there from Ranulph about that. And sadly, the idea of the Cybernetics Coalition didn't last beyond his lifetime. But it's still the case that we have the ASC, we have the UK Cybernetics Society, we have RC51 on social cybernetics that Chaime represented at the meeting today. And there's not enough cross dialogue. We tried this with the rebirth of the UK Cybernetics Society. If you remember, the request of Angus Jenkinson, the then secretary, I convened an advisory council, which brought members of all those groups together. And I thought that's what we need. We need proper places where senior people in the different fields are in contact and conversation. And I think the current generation of ASC conversations and Jason's Remy conversations are promoting that. And I think that's very important, that we are become a stronger sense of our own importance, more confident in that we have something to offer, and continue to be open to what is happening out there, particularly with I call it the younger generation, but we're now looking at people in their mid-late 30s and 40s who are forging their careers. I mean, they've got the academic positions or the research positions, and they're really busy with their agendas, and we need to pay attention to what they're saying and doing and point out to them, cybernetics, and encourage them to contribute, keep it going.
Hey, Bernard, can I you for a second?
Yes.
you appear to say that the decline of cybernetics can be related to the funding that went to artificial intelligence rather than continuing with the neurocybernetics and all the aspects of the Macy conferences. And the question I have is, with the current development of the technology, is it now the case that artificial intelligence is strongly connected to the development of organizational cybernetics, and that is already part of the renewal of cybernetics into the future, so that we can use the current development of technology not as a way of underplaying cybernetics, but as a way of enhancing the future of cybernetics. Do you see a relevance in that argument?
Absolutely, Raul. Paul, Thomas, and I, and a couple of other people are part of an ongoing conversation about just this topic, and it's also been addressed in various ways in the AC conversations. It is recognizing that the technology is becoming more and more powerful and successful, such that we now have, as an example, such that we now have artificial intelligences which are capable of really close simulations of being a participant in conversations. So we've got what is known as conversational AI as an example, and from the cybernetic side, of those of us who are familiar with past conversation theory can see that there is an emerging convergence where the AI people are becoming more interested in this conversation theory concepts of conversation, and we on the conversation theory side are becoming more excited about what they're doing. So the bigger picture, and I, as I said before, there's always bigger. The bigger picture for me is that globally, planetary wise, we have the driving force of all the constraints that humanity has to manage and learn about. We're still learning about what constraints are possibilities of existence on the planet. And we need to combine these holistic understandings with the proper use of the technology to help solve them and study them, but also to foster fruitful cooperative conversations where cybernetics and its interdisciplinary role and transcendent role can help afford the conversations that are necessary between the different disciplines as we become more and more and more obliged to work together, to communicate together. So the original mission of cybernetics, bringing the different disciplines together, remains, and is now as urgent as it ever was. And whether it's the ecologists or the AI people or the social scientists and so on.
Yes.
Can I just go for 1 second? You have put the emphasis in technology and AI. My question was also relating all this to organizational cybernetics. Is it organizational cybernetics something that we can bring together into the current developments of the cybernetics and make of that a major theme?
Okay, thank you, Raul. You see, this is where our different concepts and different terminology, because I know from up to recently, I know your work is mainly to do with organizational cybernetics in the sense of business systems or governmental organizations in that sense, and based essentially around the VSM. And I see that as a kind of a subset within the wide field of cybernetics and socio-cybernetics and so on. But I just read last you were talking in your terms about your interests. I did after that read your recent paper in which you used concepts from the VSM and your own elaborations of that to address global issues of basically geopolitics and questions of governance, which are global and are certainly these are cybernetic issues. And so this broader sense of what you mean when you say organizational psychology is absolutely relevant. Yes. And, you know, I address this in various ways, but I think it's in chapter 9 or 10 where I discuss culture, but it's the same agenda of what's happening on the planet with respect to governance and communication between nation states and so on and so forth.
Good.
Very good that you made the connection between that chapter and this thing. I think clearly we will discuss much more about that later on when we go to later chapters in your book.
Yes, agreed. Good.
Yes, indeed. Hope so.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Ro. Let's return again to some of the specifics of Bernard's book and the next section called Cybernetic Explanations. Thomas?
Okay, this one is more related to philosophy, mostly because I'm trained as a philosopher, but it kind of perked my interest. But you argue that von Foster escapes from solipsism by asserting that an observer who distinguishes other cells must concede that, as cells, they are capable of distinguishing her. Does this really mean solipsism has escaped? And how are you defining the term? And why, or is it important that we escape solipsism in cybernetics?
Yeah, I think you mean to say, does this really mean that we have escaped from solipsism? Yes.
Yeah, I wasn't too sure how to pronounce that term, even though I'm a philosopher.
It's all right. It's your dyslexia. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to be personal.
No, I don't have dyslexia, actually.
That was a joke.
Thing I've got, but don't worry.
It's all right, so it's not that, Thomas. I'm just joking.
Or you didn't slip, don't worry, Bernard.
Yeah, okay. Well, you're the philosopher in this conversation in the sense that you've got more deep training on these concepts. I mean, I was aware of the concept of solipsism, that there's a sort of position of extreme skepticism, which doubts the existence of the external world. And we can certainly quote Descartes on that when he comes up with "I think, therefore I am" as his founding point. Now, von Foster, what I like this is that he's aware of the social nature of the self, whereas Descartes is saying "I think, therefore I am." Von Foster is aware that we are social creatures. We've been socially, we grow into a society, into a culture. We're not just some isolated I thinking. And so I think it's very neat that somewhere he also says what we should be saying is we think, therefore we are. So, and if you take it a step further with Pass, you have the clear understanding that we as individual persons, but I'll use the word persons there, are also conversational in form, that we are thinking with, there's no stable I, like I think. It's the different perspectives in my thinking that are doing the thinking. And it's an ongoing process from moment to moment of conceptualizing the world, creating the world, thinking about the world with myself. But that wouldn't be that case if I hadn't been brought up as part of human society and emerged as a human self or selves. Okay.
Okay. I think it's Paul. You've got a question.
What I was going to say is I think this does segue into what the next section is, which is Gordon Pask's conversation theory, because I think you're heading into it full speed, Bernard, which is great. So again, an overview in prior sections of part 3, in Wiener, von Forster, Maturana, and Varela. But in part 3, you have a very specific section on Pask. So this section of part 3 is called The Story of Cybernetics, and you mentioned these others, but it only has one major section about one of these individuals, and that's about Gordon Pask. And so my question, Bernard, why is Pask so important?
Okay, I noticed you've just skipped over 5B, which was Thomas.
We did.
That topic about the limitations of current AI with respect to creating intelligent systems or sentient systems that's been discussed a lot on in the ASC conversations, and the answer is yes. The hardware systems have got inherent limitations, but we've passed over that topic by all means because it's ongoing elsewhere.
In the
With
interest of
respect to
time.
this comment about why Pasc, I mean, you have to appreciate that all the great cyberneticians were or are still are, because you still exist. So this positive thing as I got older, I thought I might become more and more a kind of mature person with the gravitas in my field, and I don't. I always feel like a beginner. You know, there's always so much around that I'm still learning about or having to think about. But with respect to Pasc and the early cyberneticians, they were clear, they were holistic in their thinking, they were humanistic in their thinking. So they were concerned about the state of the planet and what was going on, and they were looking at the whole thing. And they really thought that cybernetics, as a new intellectual movement, had a major part to play. Now, within that, Pasc, though he's one of the youngest of the founders, as it were, was he was like Wiener. Pasc was a precocious genius. He went up to Cambridge, the University of Cambridge, at the age of 16, and he was extraordinary in the breadth of his interests. And by his own admission, when he read Wiener's Cybernetics in 1948, he was emotionally overwhelmed to discover that there was this conceptual framework which helped organize his own personal thinking about the world and organization, society, the natural world. He already had a holistic understanding of both the social and the natural. He was an extraordinary person. So one of the reasons I emphasize him is that with his work, it's not just conversation theory as a theory of learning and teaching, or a theory that can be adapted to the fields of architecture and design. It's also, it provides, conversation, Pasc also provides us with coherent foundations for cybernetics itself as the full architecture, first and second order. So one first said, second order cybernetics are cybernetics observing systems, or observers, if you like. With Pasc, he develops a whole theoretical framework of how to talk about, discuss, and understand what happens in human interaction, human conversations, and including a proper, clear understanding of what human beings have done when they've created the sciences. They've come together and they've formalized rules and procedures, and they've used evidence and logic, and they've done all this. From a sort of Pascan conversation and theoretic viewpoint, the dynamics of these processes are obvious. This is how the world works. So it gives us a really fresh view of, if you like, the philosophy of science, as well as a very fresh, original idea of how to view society, culture as a whole, of all these conversations taking place between us as we create ourselves and we create our worlds in collaboration or conflict with others. So
Bernard, I hear you talking about scope and depth of Pasc's work, I think.
Yeah.
Would be an oversimplified comment. Thomas has a follow-up.
Sorry.
Yeah, so one question I have, wait, am I doing 6 people? I just asked a sort of follow-up question I've got here. Okay, Pasc's theory is much more fleshed out and elaborated account of human cognition, learning, and communication, and what is found in the writings of either von Forster or Maturana. Why do you think this is the case, and is it so?
Oh, very much so. I mean, Pasc was he was an essential discipline. I mean, he had a sort of checkered educational career, but after graduating, I think he ended up with a degree in physiology from Cambridge, having messed up his medical studies in various ways. He was a very unusual character. He began inventing his machines. He began engaging with the cybernetics community, and he worked in the theatre. He did all sorts of things, and eventually settled down more or less, thanks to some regular funding from, in the first place, the United States military, to study the cybernetics of learning, of learning systems.
Because my understanding of it is, if I can interject here for a moment, was it seems that von Forster and Maturana are focusing more primarily on biological, like lower level biological systems, but with PASC, he's also bringing some stuff from human culture and higher level, like psychological processes into it, if that makes sense. So he was influenced by people like Stanislavski, Lang. So he seems to be dealing with, in some sense, both levels of human cognition, like higher and lower order stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I just passed that over by saying he was a psychologist, but he was a very particular kind of psychologist. He was part of what became known as the cognitive revolution across the world, but very specifically in the UK, where people started using ideas from information theory and cybernetics to develop models and machinery to do with human cognition or how the brain works and stuff like that going on. He was part of that, but he was also aware of, and that tradition included some very sophisticated experimental psychologists studying, following on people like Craig, studying human sensory motor systems and so on and so forth. There's a very strong basis there, which challenges anything in the United States at the time. I sent a link to the Ratio Club, which is, if you're not familiar with the Ratio Club, it was a UK development, a club that founded in 1949 after the publication of Wiener's book, in which cybernetic ideas were discussed by some really top-grade thinkers, including Ashby and Alan Turing. So there's a lot of stuff going on there in the intellectual circles. But PASC did do experimental psychology. He understood the methodologies of doing psychological experiments, and in later he clearly, when he came, when conversation theory was born, he said, if you're ever experimenting with human beings, apart from if you somehow try to be an invisible observer, like looking through a one-way mirror, perhaps, but anytime you're doing an experiment with a human being, you're doing social science, because you are, what else you're doing? You're conversing with another human being. You have a conversation with the human being for them to agree to play the role of an experimental subject in a specific setting and to pursue particular goals in that setting. So the whole of the experiment, the scientific experiment, is embedded in a conversation between the experimenter and the subjects. It's called establishing an experimental contract. But he could see that, because he wasn't just a cognitive psychologist, experimental psychologist. He was aware of the social dimension of doing any psychology. So,
I mean, it's good that you mentioned this, because this kind of relates to next question I have. Now, the experimental contracts you've just mentioned, my understanding was that he was quite influenced by the experiments of Piaget and Lev Vygotsky. But my next question is related to PASC's indebtedness to Lev Vygotsky. He acknowledged his indebtedness throughout his work. How different do you think is PASC's own thinking from Vygotsky's, though? Because of one thing I've noticed in Vygotsky, they talk about, sort of Vygotskians tend to have this idea that external speech comes before internal speech, yet with past conversation theory, since there's kind of a conversation already going on in the mind, it would seem to imply that there's internal speech before external speech. Now, have I misinterpreted something?
Yes, you certainly have.
Okay,
Yes,
well,
you certainly have. You're trying
Okay.
to imply that past is dealing with some kind of transcendental ego, you know, that's is it talking to itself before. No.
Could you clarify?
Well, Vygotsky's Thought and Language, but it was published in 1962, as you know, and Pascal's already active. Well, it just began. System Research had converted itself into a research organization in 1960. So it was then focusing on being an experimental psychologist and theoretician. And in 1966, there was a huge tome. I can't remember his name now. He's a very famous American psychologist who began the work on metacognition a bit later. His name will come back to me, but it's a big, thick book, and it's about Jean Piaget, the psychology of Jean Piaget. Up to that point, very little of Piaget had been translated into English, and very little of it had been. This book gives us an overview, a commentary on Piaget's work as a coherent one. And both Piaget and Vygotsky arrived just as the cognitive revolution was happening in psychology, thanks to the influences of cybernetics. So all these things come together, and you have the cognitive psychologist and developmental psychologist really getting excited about Vygotsky and Piaget, as they now understand him, as being basically other cybernetic thinking style precursors. I mean, Piaget lived long enough to embrace cybernetics when he came across it, and has written very eloquently about cybernetics in several places. Vygotsky was long gone by then, but they are cybernetic in flavour and how they look at the world and so on. But the thing about that differentiates Pascal a little bit is that I think, well, Pascal was influenced by those two, and in 1966 he published a paper called Cybernetics of Ethical, Psychological, and some of the other systems, in which he gives extended commentaries on both Vygotsky and Piaget, and uses his own cybernetic understanding, precursor to conversational account of child development and the emergence of what you call a self or a psychological individual. So, but he draws on both Piaget and Vygotsky in that, but he's well aware of the discussions from Vygotsky and Luria about how what starts as a child as an external speech, which the child uses not just for communication, but also to control her behavior. You know? So press button. If the child has been asked to press a button, the child will say to itself, press button, and press the button. These stages are mapped to the point where eventually the external speech becomes internal speech, and we as adults can control our behavior through our internal thinking, our internal truncated languages, which control everything we say and do when we're consciously monitoring it. So the big difference here is there's just one place in thought and language where Vygotsky refers to the inner dialogue, but he doesn't develop it. Now, Past develops that idea to the inner conversation, which is the psychological individual. And as far as I know, and very interesting thing to note, although he, thanks to his interaction with von Förster, there's a kind, and Maturana, there's a kind of tripartite evolution of their thought, where all of them become in one way or another of the ontogenesis, the child, how child development works to bring about cells and communities of cells using different terminology. But one thing that's missing from all those accounts, none of them were aware of George Herbert Mead's work on the self as a social process in social psychology, sociology, which is another great source. I mean, there are other places, but that's an omission. So there's that particular difference between Pask and Vygotsky, I'd say. But in other words, they're perfectly compatible, because Vygotsky, as you know, went on to talk about higher mental functions and the whole business of being a human being as part of a culture, and Pask thinking, possibly influenced by some of Vygotsky's emphases, certainly is already in that direction. Right from the beginning, he's looking at the social world that he's a part of and seeing it through a cybernetician's eyes or through his own vision. And okay.
Good,
Would
Bernard.
you-
This is wonderful.
If I
Thomas?
just ask a small follow-up. But so with your understanding of Pask, there's no inner dialogue for external speech, because this is one thing I've been struggling to find clarity on, because with Vygotsky, he seems to imply that inner dialogue comes after external speech. But I just wanted to know what your take on it was.
Yeah, I follow Vygotsky in that sense, but I say it's the inner speech is dialogic. It's conversationally informed, that we as humans are always conversing with ourselves. And Pask goes as far as something like, he refers to proto-conversations. You have to sort of see this in quotes, proto, and that the brain-body system is always communicating with itself in different ways. It's not a mechanical hierarchical system with a controller at the top and everybody down below and doing. It's got endless forms of feedback coming up to the point where the whole system is heterarchical. And at any one point, different parts of the system take control and demand our attention. So any moment now, Paul is going to call a 5-minute rest so that we can empty our bladders.
And I was just going to offer that.
or grab a quick cigarette. Oh, I just smoked them right away.
We will take a very quick break. We'll see you back in a couple of minutes. Thank you, Bernard. Yeah, I've stretched it far beyond the hour I promised everyone. So we'll see you back in just a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
Great. Thomas, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah.
And of course, others should feel free to jump in. We'll, Thomas, after your question, we'll more explicitly open it up to broader questions and comments from everyone.
Okay, Bernard. You use aspects of Pask's work a lot in your book, including various diagrams illustrating the various processes that are going on in conversation theory. One important illustration you do not deploy in your work is that of the entailment mesh. Could you explain what it is to our audience, as well as why you decided not to include it? It might also be good to potentially distinguish here the difference between entailment structure and entailment mesh, because...
Well, this is why it's not in the book. I mean, I can't emphasize, the book is literally 50,000 words. Actually, maybe 49,999 words. I can't remember. But I was working to this constraint, and there just wasn't. I had to be very selective in what I could deal with in any detail. I do mention the idea of entailment meshes, entailment structures, but in logic, in logic philosophy, the concept of entailment, that some concepts entail other concepts, is quite understood. So what? Well, let's start again. So what?
I think you've answered my question.
Well, that's the question of that. But you say you just asked me to make a distinction between the structures and intelligent message. Let me try and get this across to everybody so they can see what I'm doing. Now, right now I'm engaged in this conversation. I say that my multiple selves, my many selves. At the moment, I'm a particular self in this conversation with the other selves, and together we're creating the larger psychosocial unity that is the conversation. Now, what it means that I have a certain set of concepts in mind, which I'm organizing and reorganizing in order to address the questions that are being put to me. It also includes picking up the piece of paper and drinking my glass of water. So I'm managing and monitoring this particular domain. And so I've got a lot of ideas in my head and I'm doing things, including the speaking. It's a conversational domain in past terms. Now you can characterize a particular conversational domain in terms of the concepts which are being applied. And for past, a concept is a procedure. It's like a program, a computer program. So I've got all these programs running, procedures, which are helping me remember what to say or creating what I'm saying, and other procedures which are turning into speech and movement and so on. So that's the conversational domain. And I can take the concepts in this particular domain at some level of abstraction and summarize them and say, well, it's about cybernetics. And beneath that, we've got AI, we've got conversation, we've got child development. So there's a set of topics here. And if I wanted to turn that into a book or a formal account, then I'd come up with an hierarchy of topics as they relate one to another underneath the main topic. So there's the entailment relations between topics, and somewhere down at the bottom there'll be some concepts or topics which I assume everyone has. So everyone will know what's understood by part whole, for example, or set subset, or up down. There's certain basic concepts you're taken for granted, taken as being already understood. Now that gives me an hierarchy of entailed structures. Now, what I've done there is out of the whole mishmash of possible thoughts and ideas and concepts that I have or we have, I've selected a particular conversation domain and I've represented it as an hierarchical entailment structure. If I try to represent or picture the whole domain of my concepts and all their interrelations, then I have what Pascal calls an entailment mesh. And the best way to think in dynamical terms is a continual process of concepts generating other concepts and evolving and transforming and so on. So the whole of my body of thought is going on, much of it unconsciously, subconsciously, while I'm focusing on a particular topic while my awareness is in a particular direction. But the rest of it is still going on. So there are things going on. And I've used the example, if somebody calls my name, perhaps Bernard, then I orient myself into a different domain and start thinking, who's that? What's going on? Or if someone says, you do the driving, Bernard, and I sit in the car, and all the relevant concepts and skills, because a skill is a concept applied, come to bear, and I start driving the car with the wheel and the gear stick and things like that, because I've learned how to do this and I've acquired all the relevant concepts and the procedures that they entail in terms of what I need to do to drive the car. And much of it has also become proceduralized, it's become automatic. So I am automatically doing, and this is what's his name's distinction between fast and slow thinking or something. The automated proceduralized stuff is quite quick. It's the conscious stuff that tends to be a bit more slow, but even that is accompanied by an ongoing conceptualization process of ideas sitting around in the background, ready to be used if needed. So, and this is framed within what people call it working memory in psychology. It's the working memory where we are consciously aware of what we're doing and thinking. It's the center of awareness, and we can move that awareness around wherever we like, and the relevant concepts are reconstructed, brought back into life or new ones are required. That's, I think I'll stop there because I could talk forever on this topic.
I was going to add like another sort of like point related to this, but what's the distinction between a conceptualization theory and a topic relation? Are very interconnected, and that, so it might be worth explaining this to sort of.
This is a terminological distinction that Pasc introduces when we designed the CAST system. On the one hand, where we wish our students who are learning about probability theory in our learning environment to acquire concepts of probability numbers, experimental designs, and so certain concepts which we wish them to have as concepts, as procedures that they could master, as ideas that they could reconstruct if asked to explain things, and so on. Now, we also represented the conversational domain for the student as a large entailment structure, a large map on a wall. To put it on a computer screen, same difference. So some people call it these concept maps, but in our case, we describe, we call them entailment structures, and any particular item in the entailment structure, rather than say, oh, that's the concept, to distinguish the representation from the what the student's doing, the map shows topics, the relationship between topics. That's all. So the topics are the description of the concepts as presented to the student. It's just making a distinction. You have some human beings have concepts, and in education we can label concepts as topics. It's just to keep the two domains apart. Are we referring to the mental operation, or are we referring to some external description of that mental operation or that mental category?
Beautiful. Thomas, good. So let's zoom out and ask if others have questions that they would like to interject at this point. We have more questions, of course. There are always more questions. Bernard, is that one of your principles?
What's that do? Oh,
There
yeah.
are always more questions.
Yeah, we can add that one. Great. Well, there's always a bigger picture. I mean, it implies there's always more questions, but yes.
Indeed, good.
It's part of the art of thinking that we academics acquire, and which, as in our childhood, in our youth, which makes us go into being academics, is we enjoy the game of thinking about things, examining them. We come across a new idea, new experience, and I know I do in particular. Look at it. I try to look at it from all sides, all directions, to get a proper understanding of what's just happened. And I can remember thinking when I was a beginning student, I had this great cavern in which there was a little kind of table tennis ball bouncing, or golf ball bouncing about, which was my current level of understanding of the world. And gradually, bit by bit, it's just kind of expanded. Everything is completely being revisited and re-examined. Another thing I like is that Pasc is very good for talking about not just the dynamics of conversation between human beings, but the dynamics of what he calls conceptualization, how we think, how thought processes work. So yes, there's always something new, there's always more questions, but it's fun to do so. And of my particular bent, I remember Pasc wrote a reference for me when we were still talking to each other, and he said, Bernard has a theoretical bent, but is inclined to brood. If you're aware of brooding, you keep coming back to the same thoughts, and you brood about them, and eventually you emerge with some real insight.
Yes.
And this relates to the literature on creativity, where how Einstein came up with relativity theory, and how what's his name came up with the benzene ring, and so on. So you brood. No harm in brooding.
Bertrand Russell, everybody who came up with something masterful of that order. Let me invite again other questions. I saw Raul had his hand up, but also feel free to raise your hand or put the question in the chat. Raul?
No, in fact, I didn't have the hand up. I recognize that you were talking about the 5 principles that Bernard has been introducing, and last time I was trying to get more into that, but clearly is a very powerful set of 5 concepts.
Well, thank you, Ranulph. Thank you, Raul. So not Raul. Yeah, so the time you raised that topic straight away, and so I wasn't quite focused as I should be. But one question about, why are these the laws, as it were, because I call them laws, is that I challenge anyone to come up with an exception to them. So
that's exactly the point. That it's very, very difficult to give an exception, if any.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay, we've done that.
I think the second thing that came, Paul, connected to all that has been going on, is that it is apparent that Bernard is moving in the direction of a second book. So I would like to see it. I think 990 words is not enough.
My surname is Scott, which means I'm a Scotsman, and Scots people are famous for being miserly. So when writing, certainly I'm miserly with my words. I try to write succinctly. Heinz von Förster is my model. I can't do that. Whereas Irish people are just, they just
but Scots are an Irish tribe, Bernard.
Ooh.
I know. The Scotty tribe up in Scotland it means from Ireland. And in one dictionary, the word Irish means wanderer. So there you go. What I wanted to do is introduce something. It's a question that's coming up.
Go ahead.
Well, Paul, your next question was about.
No, you just go.
Okay, but it's the zooming out time. It says, Thomas says, you claim that theories in the social sciences and humanities prioritize metaphors and analogies which are liberally deployed without formal, non-linguistic justification. Is there an inherent tendency in these fields which causes this, in your opinion, or are there other reasons why might this be the case? Now, I was thinking about this. We would go back to the discussion of cybernetic explanation. I take from various sources the idea that in science, at least anyway, a theory is a model together with an interpretation. And it's the argument from central, huge body of work in the philosophy of science that there should be something non-linguistic that can be pointed to and looked at. Again, it's right into conversation theory. There should be a modeling facility in which things can be instantiated or examples provided and so on to ground the conversation. It's not just symbols whacking around in midair. There needs to be grounding. And I was thinking about this and Thomas's question with respect to the social science humanities, not all of them, but some of them certainly, and how they use metaphors and analogies. In past says about cybernetics, we use metaphors, but they have to be justified, and we justify them with, well, we also have to be clear. We make clear what they are using our models and appealing to evidence in terms of what the model's supposed to represent. But as I had that in the back of my mind, I was doing some late night reading just to sort of relax, and right before my eyes was this this extract. It's from a wonderful book for those of you who are. Can you see it?
Higher, raise it higher. No.
Raise it up, yeah.
Keep going, higher. No, not closer. But higher. There we go. Now your hands are covering the title. The World of Higher. The World of Bob Dylan.
Okay. It's book, 2 years. It's got it's a set of more or less academic style essays about Bob Dylan and his work. Some of you may know there is now a Dylan archive at the University of Tulsa, set up by a philanthropist, and scholars are just going crazy over all this new stuff. And this is a lovely book which discusses, how many other 27 different chapters discussing Bob by different authors, discussing Bob from a whole variety of contexts. And I was having to be reading this this chapter late in the book called about the Nobel Prize. So this is an example of academic writing from, you know, a commentator on culture, popular culture, or a historian, or whatever. So it's just a short section. In selecting Bob Dylan, the Academy contrived a balletic escape from the corner they painted themselves into. Dylan, of course, was not in any sense a product of America's literary establishment. Had never won a National Book Award or Pulitzer Prize for poetry, or taught classes in literature or creative writing at an elite university. Well-positioned writers and critics in the USA had never expressed the least outrage that the Academy was overlooking him. So that's full of metaphors and analogies. It's just, well, a metaphor is a truncated analogy, but it's full of this very poetic language. Basically, it's, I don't know. I mean, poetic is a metaphor. It means creation. Poetry, a product of something. So it's just an example of that, the style of writing that goes on in the other C.P. Snow's Two Cultures. I think that's a bit over-egged, that one example myself, but
Beautiful. So this was in response to Thomas's question that you.
Yeah, I just about the use of metaphors and analogies in the social sciences and humanities. So I just wanted to share the Bob moment with you.
I have found.
I'm sorry, a couple things. Thomas and then Igor. Thomas, was that a
No,
follow-up?
I just found this point very just intuitive in regards to what were Pasc mentioned globe-trotting, and also what's the other term, and that which was also, yeah, and I kind of like, or it had less to do with that. It was more like serial and holistic kind of like learning styles, and then also those two other like fallacious forms of thinking as well. And you do tend to find, I know, globe-trotting a lot in the humanities, but then in STEM subjects, you might have the other term you sort of described, where you're so overly focused on this one sort of like subject here that you'll fail to kind of see how this other subject's kind of different, like also similar, and then waste a lot of time trying to learn that other subject when you could easily just intuit that my subject I'm currently studying is analogous in ways to the other subject, such that that won't take me as much time to kind of like learn it. So I just found it as quite an interesting point, and also it is a point that strongly kind of relates to Pasc's own sort of distinctions between different learning styles.
Thank you. It's Scott's distinction.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah. Okay.
It was Pasc labels, not mine. Anyway, there's a history to that distinction between holist and serialist.
Sorry, Bernard. I want to make this clear. There's a history of the distinction between
holist and serialist.
Now, and you just said, I think that terminology is Pasc's, but the distinction is yours. That's what you said.
Well, it's not mine in any creative sense. But the first we were doing some. I was carrying out experiments for Pasc as part of one of his contracts with the military on skill acquisition, and Pasc called it a transferable where a display of lights would come up, and the subject had to press.
Igor, you're not on mute.
Oh,
Igor.
okay, sorry about this, Igor. The subject had to press buttons that were encoded according to the patterns of the lights. So it's like learning a keyboard skill, and it was explored driven by an adaptive engine, which as the subject made progress with the skill got more difficult. Put it like that, very simply. But we used a system where subjects could choose which components of the skill, which light patterns they concentrated on only one moment in time, and we distinguished people. But there were two clear patterns. One were people who were, if they had to press 4 buttons in a row, that was really the task, 4 buttons. They tried to learn them as a sequence of presses, 1, 2, 3, 4, like an arpeggio. And other people press more than one at once. First with like 2 fingers and then 4 fingers. It was more like playing a chord or pressing all the keys at one time. And we had the empirical data from all the printouts, and I studied the data and discerned these different patterns. Okay, and but it was past then called them stringers and clumpers. And on the strength of that empirical work, we got a grant from the Social Science Research Council in the UK to study academic subject matters, not just motor skills, academic subject matters, to see if bonding differences in learning strategy between students. And in those researches, we distinguished between students who adopted a holistic, global kind of approach to learning a body of knowledge, and students who took a serial one step at once approach. Now, a bit later, Pass made the distinction between what he called comprehension learning and operation learning. Comprehension learning is where you map you create some overall map of the subject domain to be learned or studied, and the operational learning is where you get down to the specific detail of mastering a task, learning a formula, constructing models and so on, actually doing something in the modeling facility. And we noted in passing that holistic people tend to be good comprehension learners, but possibly a bit lazy when it came down getting to the operational detail, whereas the operation serialists tend to be very good at the operation learning, step-by-step mastering a procedure or a proof or something, but we're not particularly good at looking at the bigger picture. And Pask saw 2 pathologies with the holistic comprehension learners. He said some of them are prone to globe trotting, and that they just go around thinking about these things and don't give them a grounding. Instead, he went as far as to say there's some people who are pathologically globetrotters, and that they just weave everything that's collected, everything else in their ideas, but they're never grounded in any particular evidence or examples. Whereas the people who are good at the operational details, like, certain kinds of mathematician and computer programmers, dare I say, because you can see the differences in how some people approach that's a separate study we did later. But he calls out the people who are prone to just stick to the operational detail improvident, because they would fail to see that when they worked in an analogous domain, they didn't see the analogies between them. So they were often learning the similar things over and over again without realizing there was an underlying common structure. And there's a broader literature in the psychology of learning about generalization between one domain of knowledge and another domain of knowledge. So he was speaking right into education theory and epistemology in making the distinctions.
Okay, great, Bernard. Thank you for that depth.
My pleasure.
I was anxious in particular to get your relationship to it all clear. Retrospective apologies to both Igor and Jerry, Jerry in particular have been waiting a long time to ask a question, but they've both needed to go. Any questions from those here? We could have 1 or 2 closing questions before the time is. Nothing here. Okay. We touched on this, and it might be a nice ending question. You're writing another book, Bernard, or thinking about writing another book. What will that book be?
Well, I'm not sure, Paul. I some of you may know that. Well, when I finished writing the book, I thought I was retiring from academic work, and I was about to downsize my house and move abroad. So I actually sold off a lot of my book collection, which I'm now buying again because I miss them. But I thought I was retiring, but I didn't. Prompted by Raul to write something for a collection that he and Vladimir Levsky were editing. I came up with the idea. In the back of my mind, I wrote a little paper called Second Order Cybernetics and the End and Beginning of Philosophy, which essentially argued that with second order cybernetics, classical philosophy is of historical interest only. There's nothing coming out new out of there, which isn't. It's either cybernetics or it's not. And I'm that extreme in my views. And that could be, but that was a short paper. And I've been thinking I might write another short paper where I'm tracing the history of thought back to Aristotle and bits of Plato up through the story of cybernetics. And I don't know whether that will be just another short paper for the cybernetics community, Aristotelian roots, cybernetic roots in Aristotle or whatever, or whether I find the time and the leisure to expand in a kind of more verbose way. I'm not sure if I could have the time or the taste for doing the latter. I might do. I don't know. I mean, I've always got plenty to say, but I don't always put it down. It doesn't always get written down.
Understood.
Yeah.
Well, that might be a closing moment. We don't have to force ourselves to go to the end. Any other comments from anyone? Thomas, any final remarks?
None that I can think of, and that actually, yeah, there is one that mostly for you, sort of like Paul. Thanks for scripting this a bit for me, because if this is the first time I've done something like this, and to be honest, if I didn't have like any sort of like not know what I would be doing in that, so I am incredibly grateful for that and for your effort. But yeah,
it's a pleasure. Thanks for saying, Thomas. It's only one. My final remark would also be thanks to everyone, especially Bernard, for being such a good friend and colleague, and for making this contribution. Last night, by chance, I was talking to a bunch of budding cyberneticians, let's say, in a program in Australian National University. Maybe you've heard of it. They've started a, quote, school of cybernetics. And I have some qualms about what they mean and why they go about it the way they do. But when asked what book should they read, this is clearly the answer. And I appreciate so much what Bernard has done. Bernard, I give you the last word.
I repeat the thanks I gave at the beginning. Thanks for you and Thomas for being the participant in the Discussants session. And thanks for everyone else who's taken the trouble to sit in, join in, contribute, or whatever. And thank you so much. I mean, thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Thanks to Jason, as always.
See you in next chapter.
Till then, many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.
Bye-bye.